Hey everybody, my name is Jared Patterson and I'm here on behalf of Canadian Youth Worker with Kelly Schwartz, who back in May we started in Calgary something we called a Parent Huddle, and Kelly presented or began a presentation on 5 family assets, and he's going to continue that conversation today, or I guess restart it, and then we're going to talk about those family assets some more. So, all right, Kelly, why don't you take it away?
Awesome. Thanks, Jared. Good to be with you guys. I'm looking out my window here in August, beautiful summer day, and it was not a beautiful day in May when we did this workshop for the first time. We had a great small group of parents and youth workers out, and it was just a great time to talk about family in general, and we had just some good discussion and good interaction about kind of the state of the family. And so what I want to do today is just go over some of that intro stuff, and then introduce us to the family assets framework, and get us thinking potentially in a new way about how family systems work. Talk a little bit about the cultural changes that have impacted on the family, and then introduce to you some research, but more importantly, introduce how this research impacts on our family development over the course of a family's history. There's my phone ringing. I'm going to ignore that. So let's get going here. I'm going to open up slide here. Hope you guys can see that. Okay. So, like I said, this was a little bit on the title. Of course, when I was constructing this this workshop, we were in the heat of the Stanley Cup playoffs back in April and May. So I titled this "Minors, Majors, and Game Misconducts," and this first section is going to be about what I've just called the major strengths of family. And in future workshops, in fact, when we do our youth worker gatherings in September, Jared can fill in on that. We're going to do another workshop coming up here. I'm going to talk about minors, and when I talk about minors, we're going to talk about developmental assets that all kids and youth can develop. Another future workshop will be on game misconducts, meaning what do we as parents with the best intentions do to mess up our kids. And it'll be a humorous time of self-reflection and self-disclosure on some of the stupid things I've done as a parent. But it's going to be a great time talking just about here's things to avoid doing. So I've called that game misconducts. But today is going to be, as I said, an introduction to major family strengths. And I want to, again, here is, actually I'll get the slideshow going. Here is, again, this is presented originally on May the 3rd. We did, like I said, a great little parent huddle at Ambrose University on May the 3rd, and had a good discussion. We started that discussion by just getting families and youth workers there to think about the change that's happened over the course of a couple of generations. And I'm going to limit this to 2 generations ago. So depending on what sociologists you read, generations are between, somewhere between 15 and 20 plus years ago. So we're talking, getting back to the late 60s, early 70s. And so when you stop and think about the change that has happened, not only for families, but even for culture in general, it's pretty daunting to think about being a family in the 21st century. So I've just broken up this discussion into, here's less than 2 generations ago, so we're talking, again, early 70s through to even the early 80s, and now talking about our kids' generation. What are they experiencing? So go back 2 generations ago. We talk about a general statement like good basic training for life. And what I mean by that is it seems like we were equipping kids to be adults much more effectively and efficiently than we are now. In fact, my work as a school psychologist and as a psychologist here in Calgary, we meet dozens of families every year in the clinic that I run at the University of Calgary, where we see lots of kids coming in that just don't seem to have a general grasp on not only their present, but how to be prepared for the future. And I really feel like, the culture itself prepared kids to be adults much better than it does right now. And so we're starting to see in our clinic a lot more kids, and especially even their parents, coming in with just a real heightened anxiety about the future. And I think part of that anxiety is because we don't know, or we're confused by all the competing sources of information that are coming in telling us how to raise our kids. I was saying to the group in May that you go to Chapters or do an Amazon search for parenting resources, and you're just inundated with kind of the latest trends and philosophies and frameworks on how to raise kids. What I think this does is, even though that all this information is good, in some ways it paralyzes us from being able to truly focus in on getting to know our own kids and getting to know on what it takes to train them for the future. Part of that is, the second point, that a couple generations ago, it seemed like kids were very much part of the family's success and family's health. The tasks that were required of kids, especially if you grew up in a rural or even kind of a semi-rural area, was that you were part of the day-to-day life and operations of the family. Now it seems like, again, both in my own family situation and when I talk to parents, we talk about, well, what's the kids' responsibilities at home? And they'll say, well, keep their room clean and do their homework. And, well, none of those tasks are vital to the family's health and longevity. If a kid doesn't clean their room, it's more of an annoyance rather than, wow, the family's going to really suffer as a result of this. Previous generations would tell me, and even my own upbringing on a little farm in northeast Saskatchewan, was that we had tasks that if they weren't done and if the responsibilities weren't met, the family in some way suffered. And so as a result of that, I think kids know that they are loved by their families and cared for, but I'm not sure that kids are, through the tasks and responsibilities that we have them do, are told that they are valued in our society and in our families. Again, 20, 30 years ago, work was much more centered on the home. The maternal workforce back, in the late 60s, early 70s, was still under or hovering around 50%. So, moms outside of the, working outside of the home. Now, our economy is dependent on having males and females almost equally engaged in the workforce. So what has this done? Well, it's certainly empowered women and communicated to them how valuable a resource they are to our culture, as if they weren't already, but from an economic perspective. But of course now we've got work separated from the home. So kids are spending much more time on their own. We know that all the horrendous risk stats that between the hours of like 3:30 and 6 in terms of exposure to sexual activity, online risk behavior, all those things that happen in those peak hours after school but before the parents return home from work. It's just created a whole new era of risk. And partially this is because, again, families and parents their work is decentered from the home, whereas 30 years ago there was much more chance that the work was centered in, or at least close to, the home. Looking even at family size, wasn't uncommon at all for families to be 3, 4, 5, 6 kids, and again because we needed the large families to assist with the work that was required around home. Now, not uncommon that, in fact, the Canadian average is about 1.7 children per family. Now that's got its own problems because we're not reproducing ourselves in terms of a cultural and social workforce. But it also means that we are having children now out of want rather than out of necessity, which, again, when work was centered at home, rural life required lots of kids to be engaged. Now we don't need kids. We want kids, and we love wanting kids, but it's not our sustenance is not dependent on having many hands around to assist with the work. So that's changed. Again, because of the economic changes and workforce issues, families have to move. They have to be mobile for their work. So that means, not uncommon at all for families to be a plane ride or two away from extended family because the families had to move for work. When I grew up in, again, northeast Saskatchewan, I grew up across the farmyard from my mom's parents. So my grandparents were literally 20 steps away. I had aunts and uncles that were 5 or 6 minutes drive away from where I grew up. Now kids are growing up in an environment where, they don't see cousins ever, or they see them once every 5 years. Aunts and uncles are not a part of a meaningful kind of mentoring other adult relationship. And so that's impacted on our kids' development. Hope I'm not repressing anybody. This is just meant to show how the culture is shifting, but I think you're getting the sense of this. Look at the mother-only families back 2 generations ago. Looking at Stats Canada data, well under 10% of mother-only families back in late 60s, early 70s. Now, mother-only families in Canada make up 1/5, 20% of our family structures. You don't have this monumental shift. This is a 300% increase in, we're talking 2 generations. So we're convulsing a little bit on how to, best support mother-only families and even how to best understand them. But as a result of this, culture keeps moving and families keep moving forward. And we've got a whole new group of family systems that include a mother-only or a single-parent family system for which we are, again, we have lots of data, lots of research, but it's still very fresh and new as a family system. Okay, let's go through these other ones a little more quickly. Few hours of education. I tell the story of my grandfather, who was a farmer in Saskatchewan. He was one of the most learned adults of his generation. He finished grade 8. He had to leave school to go and work on his family's farm, but continued to be kind of quote unquote a scholar because he loved to read, he loved to learn. Well, now we've got more hours of education than we ever have had in human history, and yet we hear an outcry from educators, parents, politicians that our kids are not keeping up with, they're not being prepared for work and advancement in adult life. So something's happened there. We're inundating our kids with more hours of education every year, and yet we're struggling to meet the demands of a changing technological society. In fact, Jared's smiling now because we spent the last hour trying to get me on Google Plus here, and so I'm part of that generation that is struggling to keep up with the digital immigrants like myself, whereas our kids are these digital natives. They understand this intuitively, and yet, of course, we rub our hands together because we're not sure how that's going to prepare them for the future. Again, low level of information. I tell the story that back even at World War II, so we're talking mid-40s, most people wouldn't have read as much information as is contained in a daily newspaper here in Canada. Now kids have rapid access to information. Nothing happens in the world without the rest of the world knowing about it within minutes or hours. That's changed the way that we approach education. It's changed the way that we understand history, because history doesn't happen, you know, over the course of us understanding it in months and years. We now are engaging with history as it happens almost automatically. Oh, Jared says my slides aren't changing. Okay, let's go back here. Jared, where did you lose me? Were you getting any of that slide transition at all?
It's we haven't seen anything except the title slide at the beginning.
Are you serious? Oh, okay. Can you see those now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on this. I'm going to leave it on this slide.
Perfect.
Okay, so there's the first slide that we just walked through. So I'm going to let that sit for a minute. That just tells you, again, all the basic training, the change in family demographic, large families, mother only. Now I'm on to slide 2. This is fine. I'm going to leave it here. So now we're talking about education and information. Don't even have to make a comment really about technology. Again, it is. In fact, I'm just upgraded some of my wife and my oldest daughter to some iPhones in the past 48 hours here, and again, the gravity of cognitive shift that is happening in how we process information because of technology is really quite stunning. And I don't need to dwell on that. That's a workshop. Well, it's multiple workshops in and of itself in how technology is changing the way we relate to each other. And in fact, just as an aside, some of the research I'm doing with some of my graduate students at University of Calgary is about how, again, cyber technology is changing the way that adolescents relate to one another, and of course with the fear of cyberbullying and the reality of cyberbullying, and how that's changing the way that we have to intervene from a clinical level. Huge area. You see there I've got moral value system less than 2 generations ago. Some might question whether or not that's accurate or not. But I would say, 2 generations ago, we had a pretty good understanding, at least we communicated a good understanding of what was right and wrong. Black and white issues were black and white. Now it's not that we have an immoral value system, but cultural anthropologists would say we have an amoral value system. It's a value system that is based on, of course, very much about choice, about an acceptance and a promotion of tolerance that may, again, challenge people's moral values. And it really, from a parenting perspective, challenges parents, because we want our kids to be accepting, forgiving, showing grace, all those things. But it also means that in some cases we have to we get into some moral dissonance about where do we step in and say, no, this is still against what we believe, without in some ways being discriminatory. And that's a very difficult place for parents to be in. I just make the comment about little anonymity compared to much anonymity now. I tell the story about how even in our financial systems, our banking systems, I don't go to my bank anymore. I deposit everything and do all of my banking online. I don't have to see anybody. That's the same thing with many of our social interactions that involved us getting in the faces of our storekeepers, of our teachers, all that sort of thing. Now we can be anonymous. We can communicate electronically. We don't have to have that face-to-face contact, and that's changed the way that we understand our social relationships. I've talked a little bit about intergenerational contact already, how important that was a few generations ago. Kids had that constant or at least regular connection with intergenerational members of their families. Now that becomes an event rather than a day-to-day or at least a regular occurrence. Families have to travel to see each other. They have to make, again, family reunion dates to get families together rather than having that regular contact. So that's different. Lastly, a couple things. Consistent role models versus inconsistent role models. If you ask kids 20, 30 years ago who their heroes were, they would likely say, that it was a sports personality, that it was a political leader, that it was a teacher. Well, now when you ask kids who their role models are, you're likely to get a great diversity of response. It's going to be musical artists. It's going to be a person that they've never met. It's going to be almost like a virtual role model. Could be an author. Could be a blogger. Could be so. The role models that kids have these days is again, there's not going to be any consistency. I don't think that's bad, but I think it again, from a parent and family perspective, means that the people that our kids are looking up to are going to be different than what we would consider and people that we would even know. And so that changes the way that we engage with our kids in terms of those role models. The last one, and again, these are not exhaustive lists of the changes in a generation, but some of my research and work is in peer groups and in friendship patterns. And 2 generations ago, I'm not sure you'd be able to identify a peer group outside of family connections. And so my best friends were kids that my family knew, and my parents knew their families and knew the parents. Now, of course, the last 25, 30 years heightened emphasis on peer group. And again, I would say the difference is that we as parents may not only do we not know the kids that our kids are hanging out with, but we don't know their families and their parents. And again, it's only through intentional contact and connection do we get to know that. So it's not that we're bumping into these families and other kids 3 or 4 times a week. These kids are school connections only, but that kid may be a 20-minute drive away, even though they attend the same school as our children. We don't cross paths with those families. So I know what you're saying. What a great news story, Kelly. Thanks for sharing all these changes. This isn't meant to depress or discourage, but it is meant. And again, these are not exhaustive lists of changes. All this is meant to do is to get us to understand and think about the gravity and the breadth of change that our kids are growing up in, and how this is impacting on how our families are developing and how they're functioning. Now, I said to you that, as I said, I work as a psychologist here in the city of Calgary and direct a clinic at the University of Calgary, but I also, am heavily involved in my community. I coach a lot hockey in the winter and girls softball in spring and summer, and these are things that I run up against on a daily basis. Some of these changes, and it's not that I run up against the changes. I'm running up against the effects of these changes. And in particular, I'm struck by, again, how our culture and our society looks at kids as that they're growing up in an environment of risk. And I certainly think the levels of risk that kids are growing up in is heightened, no question, between what I grew up with, what 2 generations ago grew up with, and what our kids are growing up with now. What I see, though, is that parents and professionals see childhood and adolescence as something to be endured rather than something that has inherent strengths in it. And this is where I the slide here I have about we love strong things. We're preoccupied with strength. In fact, I've given a couple examples here. We want our economy and our business to be strong. We want our political parties to show strength and to be confident in the power that they have. We want our military to be strong. That's kind of insert a smirk there when we talk about Canadian military. But we know that with all the stuff that's going on, even this month in the Middle East, where so much about our human future is based on military strength, that we haven't seen again in 20 or 30 years. It's coming to the fore again. We want our sports teams to be strong. Entertainment is based on movie tickets sold and albums sold and things like that. So when we look at our culture, there's a preoccupation with strong things. But as I said, this seems to be not the case when it comes to family. Like I said, we tend to think about family and childhood as being characterized by an identity. You can see here I've said an identity of risk, crisis, dysfunction, threat, or even when we talk about family, how it's becoming obsolete. So we have all these parts of society and culture that are connected with strength, but then when it comes to the family, we all kind of roll our eyes and go, oh man, family's in trouble, family's at risk, family is disappearing. But I want to show you, and I want to celebrate the strengths that are happening in the family, because I think that's where not only our future is, but I think this is where the present is, and that's what I want to talk to us about. I put this little photocopy of an article that was in Maclean's magazine about 3 years ago, where it's not disparaging the family, but it's saying family is not even part of the discussion when we start to talk about our future, because so many people characterize the family as in decline or at risk, or even at its worst in crisis. And again, what I want to show us is that that family is not that at all. So again, here's some of the dominant story themes about families. It's either blamed or glorified. Just as a little aside here, I want to qualify everything we're going to talk about here about family strengths in saying that as much as I want to identify strengths, I also don't want to over-glorify the family and say that the rise and fall of childhood and adolescence is based upon the strength or perfection of family. That's not it at all, because I also think you can go too far and say that the family is too responsible for the outcome of our kids. We know, in fact, some of the best research we have to date says that there's a whole literature on the good enough family, meaning that there are some things that all families need to have, but it doesn't need to be perfect. And in fact, in many ways, strength in family is about authenticity, and it's about families that make mistakes, that take risks, but then picks itself up and dusts itself off and moves on. So I don't want to, not only do I certainly want to blame family for all the problems with kids, I also don't want to say the entire future of childhood and adolescence is based on, families being perfect. I've already talked about the risk deficit dysfunction issue. That fourth bullet there about doesn't really matter after early childhood, that comes from in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a couple of books published about how parents don't really matter after kids go on to school, that peers and other adult influence takes over. I would counter that there's an equal and even louder set of research that says that parents not only continue to matter after childhood, but in many ways we need to be stronger in our presence after childhood. I do meet some parents, and again, I realize I'm in the clinical world, so I'm meeting families who are, dealing with certain issues of struggling with their child's development or whatever, and I do encourage them to say, I find myself saying to them lots that you do matter, and you don't need to feel intimidated by your own child as he or she is going through, adolescence and into emerging adulthood. Because what I find is that there's almost a bit of an issue of self-confidence that parents think, well, I've done my work, and now I just kind of have to get them through to adulthood without them harming themselves irreparably. Well, to me, that's the attitude that we need to combat, and what I hope that we're going to talk about today that combats against that. Lastly, I say there that families, one of the dominant storylines is that we just need to fix the family, and that's going to heal all the social ills. One comment I make is that, again, given all the changes that the family is going through and all those cultural things that are happening, I actually am a bit in awe that family isn't doing worse than it is. So on the one hand, I'm going, family is doing much better than what we think it's doing, and certainly than what's communicated in the media. And secondly, I don't think that fixing the family is going to heal all of our social ills. So I take a very balanced view on this, and I hope as a result of our talk today that will be the case with you. Okay, let's take a breath here. So what if, instead of focusing on all the things that are wrong with family and kids and child development and all that, we changed our language and we focused on what is known in the literature as family assets. Well, what do we mean by family assets? Well, family assets or strengths are not, first of all, not meant to dismiss or disregard the challenges that do face the Canadian family today. And again, I'm a huge proponent of addressing and acknowledging that, again, we've got 1 in 7 Canadian families and their children that live below the poverty line. That's a significant issue in Canada, and of course most of that is represented in our First Nations communities and in some of our northern rural communities that are heavily dealing with huge economic factors. So this doesn't minimize that. It doesn't minimize the number of families that and kids that grow up in foster homes that live in abusive and alcoholic and addictive families. This isn't meant to distance ourselves from that, but rather our goal here is to find a balance in recognizing the positive attributes that families have. And I guess this is where my frustration grows because, as you know, the media loves to communicate and loves to tell the story about all the bad things that are happening. I want us to focus on, again, those family assets or the narratives of good things that are happening with families. And that, again, some of the research I'm reading says that many families are not only not weak and at risk, but in fact they are strong and they are thriving. And that's a change in mindset that I hope we can grasp onto, and that I hope that we can come to understand not only as good proponents for family, but even as parents of our own kids and parents of the kids in our youth groups that we have on a weekly basis. So let's keep it simple here, Schwartz, the KISS principle. So what I want to do is, in the next few minutes, and I'm going to keep this short, I was saying to Jared, I want to keep these talks to about 35-40 minutes because I know, again, in our busy lifestyles, nobody can sit down for 2 hours and devote time to this. So what I want to do is introduce to us the most important, those major family assets or strengths, look at what strong families look like, and how do we identify them, how do we know that these families exist, and how do we know that this is possible for all families. And then as we look at these family assets or strengths, talk about some simple things that we can do as parents and youth workers to promote the power and presence of these assets in our own families. So that's what we're going to do here. So let's first of all define what family assets or strengths are. And as you'll see by some of the dates here, some of these family assets or strengths go back, 25, 30 years ago. I really adhere to some of the work of John Dufresne and his colleagues, where he defines family assets or strengths as relationship qualities that contribute to the emotional health and well-being of family. Now, some of these, as we talk about them, you're going to go, wow, yeah, I know this already. I know that these are assets that are important. What I don't think many of us understand, though, is A, how easily they are to attain and exercise within our families, and B, the power that they have to predict positive outcomes for our kids. Another one, David Olson, who's done lots of work with Focus on the Family in the U.S., talks about the notion of family cohesion and supporting the development of individual family members. As I said to you, one of the things that I hear from parents of teenagers in particular is how they feel like, well, I just need to take my hands off my kid during adolescence and let them kind of develop themselves, and again, hope that when we get through adolescence, everybody's still alive. Well, I want to say to you that supporting family development during adolescence is key. And in fact, if anything, we probably shouldn't, we shouldn't be taking our hands off of our kids and just hoping they get through. But in fact, it's changing the way that we relate to our kids and acknowledging the developmental changes that are happening, but still maintaining a strong sense of family cohesion. I did some research in the early 2000s where we actually looked at parent-child attachment during adolescence, and what we found was overwhelmingly, more than 80% of the teenagers we talked to and did the survey research with said that they needed and wanted a strong emotional bond with their parents during adolescence. So adolescents are not saying they want that psychological and emotional distance from their parents, and in fact, 4 out of 5 of them said they desperately need and want that emotional connection, that family cohesion with their parents. You can see the last bullet I have here is Moore says that we need a set of relationships and processes that support and protect families, especially during times of adversity and change. You probably know well the public communication about how during adolescence, kids are at one of the riskier stages of their lives, and that's indisputable. So what I want to do is talk about, again, some of these family assets that serve as protective factors. Some call this resilience. I tend to call it protective factors because not all kids and families are going to go through quote-unquote crises or significant changes. But just by going through the developmental processes of families, of family development, they are going to experience some stresses and strains that I think these family assets intervene on. So let's first, take 30 seconds here. Think about your own family. If I was to ask you what are some of the qualities and experiences in your family that you most value? So literally I'm going to pause here for 10 seconds and let you think about this. What are some of the qualities and experiences of your family that you value the most? Okay, take 10 seconds and think about that. When we did this workshop in May, I remember some of the responses that came back were that one of the parents said, I enjoy seeing my teenager come to understand who they are, kind of that identity issue. Others said they enjoy the developmental stages that their family is going through and seeing how the fruits of the labors early on in the preschool years are showing themselves now in adolescence. So the hard work that families did early on is showing itself now later on. One of the other families said that they appreciated the change in just even who, their kids were choosing as peers, meaning that they were proud of their kids, standing up for kids who were struggling, who were being picked on, again, that bullying issue. So they were proud of their kids and how they were kind of, again, not being bystanders. They were actively engaged in standing up for their, for their friends. The list could go on and on. And I think what I, when if I was to ask the opposite question here, rather than what are the things that you value most about your family, it does take some more cognitive effort than if I was to say, okay, what are the things that you're most scared about for your kids and your family? Those things seem to come a lot more automatically. And I think, again, because we've been conditioned in society to think about risk and vulnerability and crisis and trauma, and we don't ask ourselves, even in the midst of some of the stress and strain that we go through as families, to almost go back to count our blessings. What are the good things that we have? And I think, if nothing else that comes out of these talks here is to getting us to think about some of those strengths that we have. So what do we know about, so those are personal examples. Well, what do we know from the research that talks about family strengths or developmental strengths? So I want to show you really quickly some of the research that's happened over the last 20 to 50 years, and believe me, we've been studying family strengths for lots of years now, but they get lost in the cloud of things that are going wrong with families. So I want to promote those. Way back in the early 70s, social psychologist and developmental psychologist Diana Baumrind started to study the parent-child relationship styles, and she talked about authoritative families. Authoritative families are those families that have a good balance between high expectations and high responsiveness. What this means is these are families that have stated goals and objectives and for their kids, but they're responsive to the needs of their kids based on their child's development. Opposite to this are families that would be more authoritarian, meaning they'd have high expectations, but they wouldn't be responsive to their kids' needs. They would totally disregard where their kids were at developmentally. On the flip side, you'd have permissive families that didn't have high expectations for their kids, just allowed their kind of kids to grow up free range without many expectations, and they were over catering to their kids' needs, meaning the child didn't have to develop any sort of self-development because the family provided it all for them. So Diana Baumrind's work has been foundational in suggesting that we as parents need to have high and should have high expectations for our kids, but that we also need to be very responsive to where they are developmentally. Mavis Hetherington in the mid-'80s talked about this notion of family resilience, and this is about she studied thousands of families who were responding to trauma and crisis, and she was able to tell the narratives, share the narratives of these many families who, amidst constant stress, economic abuse, addictive family systems, that rose above this. And so she tapped into some of the family strengths that were apparent. And then more recent studies have considered a broader range of family processes. And I give you some lists there. Again, there's David Olson's name, John Thornton's work talking about parenting and communication and effective time use. I want to share with you some of the work that came out of an American, what's called the America Family Asset Study. They sampled, you can see on this little map here, they sampled over 1,500 families that had where they had at least one parent respondent, and the family had at least 1 to 10 to 15-year-old child within that family. And you can see that this was, well represented over America, the American landscape. More closer to home, I replicated some of this with a Canadian family strength study that we did in about 2006 or 2007. We recruited families who were frequent readers of a monthly family publication. They responded to a family survey. Again, we had a much smaller sample, about 155 family participants. And you can see there that we were overrepresented in a couple of areas. One was 8 out of 10 were in a two-parent family. We know that that's about 10 or 12% higher than in Canada. Here we've got about 7 in 10 Canadian families that live in a two-parent biological household. Well overrepresented in the white respondents, and again, you can see education-wise was a very educated population. So the stuff that I'm going to present to you from our Canadian Family Strength study is not as well representative of the Canadian population, but at least it gives a Canadian perspective on this. Now, I was saying when I was doing this presentation in May, Brian Burke, who's the general manager of the Calgary Flames, came up with a great quote, because I'm going to present some stats to you. And it was the best quote I've heard in a long time, was that, you know, statistics are as useful as a lamppost to a drunk. They're good for support, but not for illumination. And what he meant by that was, you know what, sometimes we can be led by statistics that are helpful, but if we follow them without putting them into context, we can get ourselves into danger. And so I want to share with you, again, some stats that came out of these two, American Family Strength study and the Canadian Family Strength study, that I hope is helpful to us. What we found overall from these two studies, and I'm summarizing mounds of papers that were written, especially from that American Family Strength study, into one single slide here. First off, the power of family strengths to contribute to well-being of both the youth and the parents. So what we look for in research is how powerfully does the assets predict good outcomes for families and youth. And I can tell you that the 5 assets we're going to talk about, and we're just going to cover one today, and then we'll pick up on the other 4 in another session. Those assets account for a significant amount of change in families, meaning if families could implement and embrace these 5 family assets, the potential for good outcomes for that family are 5 to 6 times greater than for families who don't implement these family strengths. That's incredibly powerful. As a psychologist, I would be happy to be put out of work, because what we would see is if families could implement these 5 assets, and they're you're gonna look at them and go, some of these are almost common sense and intuitive. But if we could implement these on a weekly, regular basis, I am convinced we would see mental health referrals decline. I'm convinced we'd see addiction rates decline. I'm convinced we'd see family structural, divorce and separation issues decline. They're that powerful of family assets. And again, I'm much more about, rather than repairing families, about promoting strengths in families so that we can, for future generations and current generations, see, incredible growth. They also help families cope with stress, because again, I'm not blind to the fact that many Canadian families live in a constant state of strain and stress. Much of it is economic. Much of it is just the day-to-day pace that we live in. And again, I think these family assets, if when implemented, could really impact on reducing that strain and stress. And then thirdly, for those families that are experiencing what we would consider kind of clinical trauma, again, I think understanding and embracing these family assets could contribute to the resilience of these families to recover from this trauma. And again, I can't overemphasize how these are simple, everyday actions and practices that every family can implement, and they're centered on the role of relationships, particularly between the parent and child relationships. So these are things that are incredibly simple and powerful that way. Okay, so I'm going to present to you now just the slide that's got the 5 family assets, and we're going to talk just in the next few minutes we have on the first family asset, and then we'll spend, as I said, we'll pick up later about the other 4 assets. So here are, and this comes out of the work of, again, the American and Canadian family asset studies. Here's the 5 major family assets. I'll read them out to you. First one is nurturing relationships. We'll talk about that today. Secondly, establishing routines. This is simply about getting a pace and regularity to family life and how that can contribute to family health. Thirdly, managing or maintaining expectations. This goes back to some of that early work by Diana Baumrind about setting expectations that are both reasonably high and developmentally appropriate. We'll talk about that. Fourth one, adapting to challenges. One of the things that, again, as a clinical psychologist, I work with families a lot in is finding patterns of coping that make sense for them as families. I think too often we say, you know, only if the family can get counseling or get therapy. In many ways, 4 to 5 families don't need therapeutic intervention. They just need strategies, evidence-based strategies on how to cope with the challenges that they're facing. So that's the 4th one. 5th one is really, can't wait to talk about this one, connecting to community. Certainly for us in the Christian community, this has a strong connection to our church and the importance of that faith community. But I'm unreservedly promoting of connecting to larger capital C community, our school community, our neighborhood community. We as a faith community need to get an understanding of, again, a balance between when do we, you know, sequester ourselves and pull ourselves away from culture, when do we need to engage with our culture and our community more. So we'll talk about that. So those are the 5 major family assets. So let's talk about the first one today, and I want to finish in the next 6 or 7 minutes here. Let's talk about the first one, nurturing relationships. The studies that we've done and the research that's out there suggests that there's at least 4 areas that contribute to nurturing healthy family relationships. Here's 4 of the top ones. Positive communication, affection, emotional openness, and number 4 is support for sparks. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So that's kind of a colloquial phrase that's come out of this positive youth development research, sparks. Let's talk about these individually. First of all, families are stronger when members have healthy relationships with one another. Again, that's something we would all probably be nodding our heads about. We know that people in healthy relationships communicate, they show affection, and they support each other. I want to go back to, again, some of the anecdotal stuff that I've talked to with parents that have adolescents, where adolescents oftentimes overtly communicate that they want less affection and that they want less day-to-day relationship with parents. I want to encourage you as a parent to not to ignore those overt forms of communication and that pushback that adolescents give, because in many ways those adolescents are just trying to establish the boundaries around their identity development. They are in the throes of coming to answer that big question, who am I? And part of answering that question, who am I, means that they do need to have some healthy separation from the family unit. They need space. They need chances to fail. And in fact, in an upcoming talk, when I talk about game misconducts, about the things that families do to unintentionally harm their kids, one thing I think that families do is they try to keep their kids too close. They don't let their kids spread their wings and fail. And so what that pushback we're getting from our kids is a lot about the kids just saying, I need space to develop who I am and to develop that identity. But at the same time, again, the research is crystal clear saying our kids need to know on a regular basis that they are loved and that that we need to show them still appropriate physical and emotional affection. And I know in my own case, I've got 3 teenage kids of my own. They've all got their own unique personalities. They've all got their own kind of comfortableness with physical affection. But I find the balance on what's appropriate, and I consistently, administer that physical affection. It's different for every one of my kids. It's not the same. And I think as parents, we need to understand that and find those comfortable boundaries and still, show that affection to our kids. And by affection, I mean that means, not only physical closeness and touch, but just, wanting to be in and communicating a want to be in close proximity with our kids. Part of this is about communication too, and again, we could do a whole session on, or a whole talk on, parent-child communication, because at each stage that our children go through, from preschool, early childhood, late childhood, early adolescence, mid-adolescence, late adolescence, the amount and quality of communication that happens at each one of those stages is different. But our kids still need and want to have healthy communication. Here's where I bring in, for all the evils that technology is assigned by way of, texting and Facebook and all that sort of thing. Even in the talk that we had on May the 3rd with those parents that were there, they would say technology in some ways has helped them to keep in regular communication with their kids, especially when their kids travel, when their kids are away on school trips. It allows for that constant communication. Now, again, there's lots of ways to misuse that or even abuse it, but in some ways, technology has helped us to stay in contact with our kids. But again, the goal for us is to find a healthy balance between too much and too little. I say here there's 3 principles that help shape relationships. One is it's two-way and it's reciprocal. Even as a parent myself, who knows all this stuff at a cognitive level, I have to keep reminding myself that it's not a one-way me parenting my child. My child is also changing the way I parent. It's reciprocal. And I find that when I speak with parents who are frustrated with where they're at in their relationship with their kid, I find that one of the things that they're telling me is, almost unintentionally, but they're saying, I'm trying to parent my kid the same way that I parented them when they were 10-year-old as compared to when they're 15 years old. And I keep saying to parents, as I remind myself, I shouldn't and can't parent my kid the same way, because I should be changing the way that I see myself as a parent as much as I see my kid changing in their developmental level. So our relationship changes over time. Our kids are changing. That's going to change our relationship with them. And again, one of the things that I want to encourage all of us as parents is to think about the way that our kids are developing their own unique personalities and what they call sparks. I've got 3 kids who are different in the way that they are developing their spark. My oldest kid is first-year university student. She is, passionate about literature and about language and about how language, shapes. She wants to be a journalist, so she's looking at how culture is shaping communication. So she's getting into reading and literature that I never thought I would be interested in. And I got to confess, I don't have a natural affinity for some of the literature, but I'm finding a way to interact with her about that literature, and we're finding ways to interact. My son is passionate about the environment and about how he wants to be an environmental architect and learn how our physical landscape is interacting with our cultural landscape. And so I'm finding ways to get involved in that. My youngest daughter, very much into sports and athletics. Now that's a much more an easy affinity for me, but at the same time, it's she has her own personality and her own competitive spirit that is way above anything I ever had. So I'm learning to embrace that. And so I use those 3 examples to say, as parents, our kids develop these sparks of interest and affinity, and we need to engage with that. We need to find a way to engage with that passion. And that's not always going to be easy, but we need to do that. Looking at some of the research, this comes out of that American Family Strengths study. Here is the percentage of kids and parents who responded to that study who suggested this was a strength. Now look at this. There's some interesting things happening with this data. You can see that affection is the highest rated strength variable in nurturing relationships. To me, that's really positive. That's saying 7 out of 10 are finding that balance. Look, though, at positive communication. Just over half are saying that that's a strength within their family relationships. So this says to me, both as a parent and as a psychologist, that one of the things that we can do to increase and nurture relationships is to really work on that communication piece. Set, some boundaries around what's expected from both our kids to parents and from parent to child in terms of communication. Because this suggests to me that we've got a lot of work to do in how we communicate with our kids and what we're expecting of that communication. Similarly, you can see that about the same number of parents and kids rated emotional openness. Here's where I'd make a strong statement to parents and say, you know what, parents, rather than trying to keep it all together and present, kind of this, level emotional response, that we need to be authentic with our emotions, that we need to, and my kids could give you example after example where where dad's lost it and he's gone way overboard emotionally in terms of a response to a situation or to an incident or something like that. But our kids need to see that we, that we have this strong emotional response. In some cases, it means we go back and apologize, and we say to our kids, "Look, I reacted this way because," and that was maybe an overreaction, and they need to see that in us because that's going to nurture the emotional openness in our kids too. If I hear again a common complaint from parents is that their kids really pull back in terms of their emotional openness, and they don't communicate this. And I think maybe one of the reasons for that is because as parents, we quote-unquote try to keep it too much together rather than, we really are authentic in our emotional responsiveness. So what can we do on a day-to-day basis to nurture relationships? Well, as I said, one of the things is positive communication. Listen attentively and speak in respectful ways. Really came out in spades at our May 3rd gathering with that Parent Huddle that we had, that for all the potential benefits of technology, we need to get back to face-to-face communication with our kids. Even though technology helps us kind of keep in touch with our kids, it can't replace face-to-face communication and spending quality time with our kids and speaking in ways that show that we give our kids full attention. I've met more than a handful of kids who covertly share with me that they don't feel like their parent is engaged with them, that their parent is being pulled in so many different directions that they just don't even feel like they've got their parent's attention. So I throw the challenge out to us as parents to say, our kids need to know that we're fully engaged with them as a child, because nothing is more frustrating than, as you know, talking with or trying to relate to someone who doesn't seem like they want to be fully engaged. So that's number one. What about affection? Connect in small ways every day. This is, again, where we can use technology. Sending a text to our kids saying, hey, we're thinking about them, we're praying for them, we're hoping the best for them, we are open to helping wherever we can. Do that regularly. We've never done the things where, I've heard some parents say they'll put notes in their kids' lunch boxes, or they'll, put a note in their kids' pockets of their coat or something like that their kid will find. Those are great things. Do that. I've never done that myself, but any way that we can express affection to our kids so that they know explicitly that we love and care for them, I don't think it's enough that we assume that that's the case. We need to explicitly express that affection to them. Emotional openness. Talk you are not engaged in. As parents, we need to show that we are interested in and want to embrace that that part of their lives. So really, really intentionally work on that. The last thing, support for sparks. Ask your kids to teach you something even though it's not your area of interest. Look for ways that your kid can teach you something that you don't know. I think nothing distances us from our kids quicker than communicating that we know everything about everything. You know what that's like in your own adult life when you're trying to relate to someone and there's no interaction. It's just about them telling you how much they know. So we almost need to demonstrate that lifelong learning interest to our kids, that they can teach us something. And believe me, there's lots they can teach us about in their culture and their peer groups and in their day-to-day interactions with with their adult mentors, teachers, and stuff like that. We need to find places that we can allow them to interact with us. Just a comment on affection. This came out of this American Family Strength study. You can see that parents the responses are in blue and youth responses are in gold. Look at just the differences between expressing physical affection. Quite a bit of continuity there between parent and child. About 4 out of 10 saying that they very often express physical affection. One that strikes me is the parent says that they laugh with their kids more than the kids say that their parents laugh with them. If there's one thing I've learned out of the hundreds of things as a parent, is that we need to laugh at ourselves more as parents. We need to take ourselves less seriously and show our kids that we are fallible and we make mistakes and that we can shake it off and shrug it off. So that's really important and really critical that we allow for those opportunities to show affection. Okay, I'm going to end this section today with this was a picture I took of my kid about 3 months ago. Like I said, he's got this architectural bend to himself, and his arms were getting tired watching movies on his iPhone, so he built out of a cardboard box a viewing station. And so I joked with the crowd that day that I don't know if Adam has a spark here or if he's just a little bit special, and but that's the creativity and that's the silly stuff in life we need to embrace with our kids, and we need to revel in it and enjoy it. So I'm going to finish here. Turn this back to Jared for a minute. When we pick this up again, we're going to talk about the other 4 family strengths. So today's was just focusing on, again, that nurturing relationships piece, and I think I've given us enough to think about. So when we come back, in fact, I'm going to break up the next one into 2. So we'll talk about 2 more family strengths, take a break, and then we'll talk about 2 more family strengths, and we'll take a break, just because there's enough there. So Jared, turn this back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. I think our heart here at Canadian Youth Worker is that this would become a resource for parents and families, youth workers, and I'm a parent myself of younger kids, and I see significant value in using this as not just in youth ministry, but in ministry and church. So Kelly's given us this stuff today as a resource, and so we want you to use it and to share it in your church context, and even if you're just a parent, to sit down and watch it for yourself, and or in a ministry context, to use it in a group setting. So Kelly, thanks for sharing with us today. We look forward to what's coming next.
Awesome. Thanks, Jared. Good to be with you.
All right. See you later.